vast Carcosa. Ruled by the eclipse.
And so, Returnal returns. Or, well, Saros. I kept seeing the news for this game pop up everywhere, and if you know me, you know I love me some Soulsy and difficult roguelikes. Critics have already been reviewing the game with high 8s, low 9s, nothing really too surprising. But then I actually started reading through the reviews and something felt off. Not necessarily in a bad way, it's just that no matter which outlet I clicked on, they were all describing almost exactly the same experience. Same strengths, same complaints, even the same examples coming up again and again. And the more I read, the more it stopped feeling like a bunch of different opinions and started feeling like everyone played a slightly cleaner, slightly safer version of Returnal. Now, sequels, or spiritual successors in this case, don't have to reinvent themselves to be good, but safe is always a red flag for me. Either way, what they're describing does sound pretty good. The combat sounds tight, but the progression sounds way more forgiving, making the whole structure just sound easier. There's this pattern where even the most positive reviews quietly point at the same weak points. So I wanted to go through what critics are actually saying about Saros and what that might actually mean for us, the fans. So, will we be getting what we expect with lots of improvements, or just a much easier game with a semi-interesting story? As I mentioned before, Saros is coming from the same team that made Returnal, and you can feel that immediately. But it's not just a copy of that structure either. Here, you're playing as Arjun, part of a rescue team sent to Carcosa after multiple expeditions disappear. There's a personal angle there too, because someone he cares about was on one of those earlier missions, so even though it's framed as a recovery operation, his priorities are a bit more focused on that. Carcosa itself seems to be doing most of the heavy lifting when it comes to its identity. A lot of the reviews talk about this constant presence tied to the sun, and these repeating eclipses. It's not just background flavor either, it's something that the entire game revolves around, so both in how the world behaves and how situations escalate as you go deeper into a run. Structurally, it still works around runs, but it's a lot more forgiving this time around. You're picking up resources during each attempt and feeding them into a permanent upgrade system back at the base, the armor matrix. That's where you're building your character over time, unlocking new stat boosts, new abilities, things that stay with you no matter how a run ends. The big difference here is that you're not just locked into restarting everything from the beginning every single time. Once you've pushed far enough, you can go back to later areas instead of replaying the same opening sections over and over again. So it still has that loop, but it gives you a bit more control over how you move through it. When you start looking across the reviews, most of them keep circling back to how the game actually feels to play. Combat comes up the most, not just that it's good, but how much is happening at once and how you're expected to deal with it. Dodging, for example, is important as you're not just dodging everything on instinct. Certain projectiles can be absorbed with your shield and turn into energy, while others start applying corruption during eclipse phases that eat into your max health. And then there are attacks you can't avoid at all, unless you time a parry perfectly. So you're constantly reading what's coming at you and deciding how to respond instead of just reacting blindly. That carries into movement as well, as you're moving a lot. Dashing through attacks, grappling to reposition, jumping between platforms while enemies are either closing in on you or controlling space from a distance. It looks like some enemies will just bum rush you directly, while the mechanical ones force you to keep moving or you get boxed in. The way those encounters are set up seems to be a big part of why people say it flows well. The progression side also gets a lot of attention, especially the aforementioned armor matrix. Many of the reviews keep mentioning how quickly it opens up, so you're not just spending hours for tiny incremental upgrades, the +2 to your shield or +1% critical damage on a full moon or something like that. You can actually come out of a solid run with enough resources to unlock multiple things at once, and that changes how your next attempt feels almost immediately. And then there's an entire structure around it, with you being able to return to later areas, skip parts you've already cleared, and approach runs differently depending on what you're trying to build. That flexibility is something a lot of critics point out, especially compared to how strict this kind of system usually is. So overall, most of the high scores seem to come from how all of that comes together while you're actually playing, not just the individual systems they're based on. Now, the setup itself is pretty interesting, but the way it plays out seems to be where opinions start to shift. A lot of reviews talk about how quickly things start to go wrong once you're in Carcosa. One of the team members basically breaks down almost immediately, talking about something being promised to them, and from there it turns into this slow unraveling. People start hearing things, acting differently, and it becomes clear pretty fast that whatever is happening on the planet isn't something they understand. And I think that's where a lot of the Lovecraftian influences start to show, as most of the story is told through what you find during your runs. Audio logs from earlier expeditions, recordings from your own team, even fragments from people trying to explain what they're experiencing. They usually start off grounded, then get more scattered as they go on, mentioning things like the Yellow Shore and whatever influence the eclipse has over everything. And if you're a fan of Lovecraft, you know there's a lot of yellow and red that comes up in the stories. Now that part seems to work for a lot of people. The mystery, the tone, the idea of a place that's slowly affecting everyone who steps into it. There's also that corporate angle in the background, with Soltari still expecting results no matter how bad things get. So a little bit of current politics in there too. Where it doesn't fully land, at least based on some of the reviews, is the characters themselves. You don't spend that much time with most of the team before they start falling apart or disappearing, so it's harder to get attached to them. Even Arjun's personal motivation is there, but it doesn't always hit as hard as it probably should. So you end up with something that's interesting to follow and think about, but not always something that pulls you in emotionally the whole way through. So getting into the scores, starting with Game Informer, which is sitting at a 9.3, they really lean into how the game feels over time, not just the setup. They spend a lot of time talking about Carcosa as a place you're constantly moving through while things are slowly getting worse around you. The logs you find early on are pretty normal, people reporting in, trying to stay professional, and then as you keep playing, those same logs start going into Crazy Town. They get shorter, with people repeating themselves and talking about lots of different things they don't fully understand anymore. That progression is something they highlight a lot, just how naturally it unfolds while you're playing instead of being pushed through cutscenes. On the gameplay side, they go pretty deep into the shield. Blue projectiles aren't something you always avoid, you're pulling them in on purpose to charge up your power attacks, and once that clicks, fights tend to change completely. They even call out specific weapons like the Smart Rifle because of how well it pairs with that system, letting you stay aggressive while still managing everything coming at you. They also talk about the armor matrix in a very practical way, so you go out on a run, collect Lucenite and Halcyon, come back, and you're unlocking multiple nodes at once. Health increases, damage boosts, cooldown improvements, things that you can feel immediately the next time you go out. They make it pretty clear that you're not just stuck doing 10 runs for one upgrade, progress comes in chunks. Then you've got GameSpot at a 9, and they come at it from a slightly different angle. They focus a lot more on how combat flows when everything starts lining up. The way they describe it, once you get used to reading projectiles, timing parries or red attacks, and using the shield to build power, fights start to feel controlled even when there's a lot of things happening on screen. They also spend time on how runs can play out differently depending on what you pick up, so weapons, perks, upgrades, all of that shifts how you approach each area. One run might lean into heavy power attacks using the shield, another might focus more on staying mobile and picking things off at range. They do mention the story, especially Arjun's focus on finding Nitya, but it's more in the background for them. What they keep coming back to is how consistent the gameplay feels from run to run. When you move over to IGN 7, the tone changes, but not in a way where they're tearing it apart. They still give it credit for the combat. They talk about how demanding it is, especially with everything you have to keep track of at once. Boss fights get called out specifically, learning attack patterns, figuring out when to parry instead of dodge, and getting through those encounters cleanly. Where they start to pull back is how the structure holds up after a while. Even with the ability to jump to later biomes, you're still repeating runs, still going through familiar layouts, and for them, that loop doesn't always feel balanced. Some runs push you forward, while others feel like you're just rebuilding again without much changing. They also spend more time on the story not fully landing. The ideas are there, the whole situation, Carcosa, the eclipse, what it's doing to the people, but some of it stays a bit too unclear. For them, it doesn't always come together in a way that feels completely satisfying. Then Comic Book, that's also at a 7, keeps it a bit more straightforward. They describe it as a cleaner version of the same formula, but not as deep as they expected. The systems work, combat is solid, progression is easier to deal with, but it doesn't feel as demanding or as layered as something like Returnal did for them back in the past. So at that level, it's less about anything being broken and more about whether the changes feel like improvements or something that pulled a bit away from what made the earlier games stand out. So looking across everything, the same issues show up more than once, just with different weight depending on the score. Game Informer still points out that the cast doesn't leave much of an impression. You're hearing recordings from your team, you're seeing how they change, but you don't spend much direct time with them before things start going wrong. GameSpot mentions smaller presentation issues. There are moments where character models don't quite match the tone of the scene, especially during dialogue, and it can kind of take you out of it for a second. IGN leans more into the repetition. Even with the changes to progression and structure, they still feel that loop coming back around too often. They also circle back to the story, saying that while it's aiming for something bigger, it doesn't always come together clearly. And again, comic book focuses more on the overall feel, saying that even though everything seems to work, it doesn't hit the same level of depth they were expecting. So it's not like people are just ignoring problems, they're just not the main thing driving the experience for most of these reviewers. The parts people are spending the most time with though, combat, movement, progression, those are the ones that seem to carry the scores. So after going through all these reviews, the biggest thing that stands out is how consistent the reaction is to it really. Even when scores drop into the 7 range, nobody is really questioning whether it's fun to play. That part already seems locked in, and I think it's the most important part. The difference is more about how much everything around that actually sticks. You can see that split pretty clearly. Some reviewers get pulled into Carcosa and its Lovecraftian mystery, into what's happening with the Eclipse and the crew. Others are going to the same game and coming out of it talking more about the systems than anything else. Same thing with the structure, the changes fix a lot of the friction. For others, it still feels like a loop they've already played through before, just adjusted a bit. So it doesn't feel like a risky game at all, it feels like one that lands exactly where it's aiming, and whether that fully works for you depends on what you're looking for going in. So being completely honest, it really just looks like an easier Returnal with a more direct way of telling the story. I actually liked the Soulsy way they handled it in Returnal. It kept everything a lot more mysterious, but again, I haven't played it yet, so it might surprise me. On the other hand, the praise from critics so far is very steady. It doesn't sound like an industry-defining moment or anything like that, but it definitely seems like it holds strong the whole way through. And honestly, that might explain the spread of scores more than everything else. I don't think this will be as much of a gamble as Sol Sesto, for example, but it'll depend on how comfortable you are with the core loop of any good roguelite. Death always comes for you. That's pretty much where it lands based on what's out there right now, but I'm still curious to see how it feels firsthand once people really get time with it beyond the reviews. And you know, player reviews are always a better marker for how good a game actually is. So how about all of you? Are you jumping in on release or are you waiting a bit on this one? And well, if you enjoyed the video, drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe if you want more. Appreciate you watching the whole way through, and I'll see you in the next one.